Hey guys, I'm Kate. Welcome back to my channel, and today I'm going to take you through my outlining process. I've gotten a lot of questions about this because I've had this channel for 5-6 years now. And so a lot of y'all have seen my journey from basically just diving straight into projects with just, you know, a hope and a dream to where I am now. I've made some videos exploring the outlining process, and so kind of slowly, gradually, over time, I have fine-tuned something that works for me. One that allows me to still be creative and flexible while I'm drafting, because I never thought I'd be an outliner. I guess because when I heard other people talking about outlining before, it sounded very rigid. I thought that they meant that they had to follow everything that they'd outlined sort of to the letter, and some people do that, but not all outliners do that, and I certainly do not. So reformed pantser is sort of tongue-in-cheek. I'm very much a fan of what works for you is the process that you need to use. And also, it's worth noting, something I've learned over time, is that what works for you at one point is not going to be the same thing that works for you always. Sometimes, like me, you go through like a little bit of a growth and evolution. Other times you find that like your process just does not work for this one story or doesn't work for a particular genre. But after doing this process for a few projects now and finding it like considerably easier and especially less stressful in like the revision and later stages, I'm feeling really solid in calling this my current writing process. So let's get into it, shall we? It all starts with an idea. Now, so there's some percolating that needs to be done up here. I do it best while I'm like out walking or seeing new things, but also even just in like the mundane ritualistic things that I do. It's amazing. Even as writers, we still don't really know where our ideas come from. But often what happens is that I will get this idea. It will tickle my brain in the right way. I might text myself what the idea is, but I've not like written it down elsewhere. It's usually like, don't forget, this was actually pretty cool. Honestly, the best ideas I find, I don't usually need to text myself, but sometimes I do, so you know what? Don't want to say never. And basically, the ideas that get turned into stories are the ideas that are sort of snowballing, right? I'm adding more to it. I'm like, ooh, that would be a cool scene, or ooh, what about this, or maybe this. Might come up with the ending, might come up with like the perfect villain to my hero, you know? I'm thinking it through. And basically when I've gotten to this point where it's like, it's starting to get very loud in my head, that's when I need to write it down. And I just get it all out. So I make a new document usually for this project. If a camp nano or like another event is coming up and I have a couple ideas in this stage, I'll maybe write them all down in one document, but normally it gets its own scripter document. And this will include all the notes I've texted myself, any kind of vague snapshot of a scene I have, things that I think would be cool to include, vague like character backstories if I have them, what I was inspired by or what I was thinking of when I had the idea. Literally anything and everything connected to this potential story goes in the scripter document. And it is like a word vomit, okay? It's not organized, it's just like, get it down. And often it kind of stays there for a little bit until I'm like at a stage where I can actually look at it. I'm trying not to have too many open projects at once. This is a me problem. And so when I get the chance to return to the project, I have everything that I thought down there. Maybe another idea will have sprung up, so I'll write it down in the meantime, but yes, it is all there for me. And this is where I really start the new part of my process, because before I would have just jumped straight in with what I had, and I don't quite do that anymore. I still zero draft, we'll get there, but before that, I try to come up with the title, logline, query, and synopsis. Okay, so like 4 sort of prep things before I'm outlining, before I'm zero drafting. Yes, I started this for the first time actually last NaNoWriMo, back when I was gonna roll the dice in order to see which project I landed on and what I was gonna be writing for the month. And it was so helpful because what happens is that through doing the title, the logline, the query, and the synopsis, I will sort of weed out the ideas that just aren't ready. Okay, so if I can't come up with a title or a logline, it's just not ready. Part of this is I'm trying to get better at coming up with titles, because honestly, it's so nice to have like a real working title that's not project whatever. I told you, it's an evolution. Especially a title that really indicates the sort of tone of the project. It may not be the title that sticks, but just something, you know, something to share. It's nice. I'll also make a mock cover, again, sort of trying to touch on the tone of the story. Then I'll work on the logline, aka the elevator pitch. This doesn't have to be perfect. None of this jumble of a process needs to be perfected, okay? I'm not giving it to anyone else, it's for me. It is for me to make the best story it can be. So it's not like I'm getting graded on it. However, this part helps me so much. And if I can't explain what the story's about yet, again, it's just not ready to work on. It can stay in its cute little idea form until I'm ready. Now for the query and the synopsis, I basically start taking all of those ideas I word vomited onto the page and sort of vaguely placing them into order. Because my notes, they are a mess. In the idea stage, different ideas come at all times, not in order, right? So I just need to place them in order. Now the query at this point, at this stage, is really just about keeping the interest. It's in a query format like you would do an agent, but again, this is just for me. But really, this is covering like the first third, first quarter of the story. The goal is to like set up some intrigue, why we should care, what the main character wants, and basically what they're up against. So I'm answering questions that will eventually help me form this story into a more cohesive than just the word vomit jumble. Not asking for perfection here, this is for me and me alone, but it is good practice. So again, all of these are like, make them as good as I can make them, but don't get stuck in this stage. You know, I don't need to fret at this point. Then I'll do the synopsis, and this is really just about laying everything out that's to come. It's not meant to be pretty, it's not necessarily meant to be fun, it's almost more like bullet points. It's basically answering the why certain things are happening. If you think of this as taking all of the notes up to this point, putting them in a sort of timeline chronological order, and then bridging the gaps with ideas and motivations, you've got it. Because the goal really here is just to guide. The next stage is still my zero draft, and I do still call it a zero draft because for all of the prep I've done, sometimes, or I have the flexibility to go completely rogue, if that's what the story wants. For all of my planning bits I just did, when I write my characters, they might be entirely different. Some of the choices I thought they might make, they won't. And so the synopsis would inevitably have to change, right? Sometimes I stumble into something really, really cool in the zero draft. Oftentimes I stumble into something really, really cool in the zero draft, and that needs to be put in later, but it wasn't something I planned for, you know? It's worth noting that actually once I have done all this work, I have not since veered like this before like I used to. I would have an idea and then I would start writing it and I would go all the way this way sometimes. Often. I haven't done anything like that. I might wiggle to the side in a way I didn't expect and wiggle back, but that's why it's a zero draft. I am someone who needs to write my characters in order to know my characters. So for as much of the brainstorming and as much of the structures I've created, until I know my characters, I can't actually figure out what the structure needs to be because I don't know why they would make certain decisions yet. It might be different than I expected. And obviously their choices are what's guiding the story, right? So the actual synopsis itself might change, but I haven't found that the query, the first quarter, first third, really changes all too much. I'm usually still pretty much sticking with what they're up against and what their motivations are. It's sort of finalized in my brain, and this gives me a great goal as I'm zero drafting to always sort of keep those two things in mind. Now, sometimes I'll finish the zero draft completely and other times I will abandon it part of the way through because I got what I needed to out of it. For instance, A Closet Full of Cauldrons, I wrote about 30,000 words in before I was like, I got it, I know who my character is now, I'm good, let me start this over. For Under the Influence, the one that the dice chose for Nano, I got 50,000, so I got the Nano goal. And now it is time for real outlining, which I would like to note that all of this would have sounded like way too much to me even like a couple years ago. This process is just from snippets that I've heard along the way and that I've tested out from various I tried writing likes, from comments. I don't think I could have done this process a few years ago because I needed to be in a place where I could like receive this helpful advice and I needed to take it in snippets. So if you're like, outlining is not for me, but like that one cool thing you said is, take any or all snippets that you think might. Otherwise, it's just fun to hear, right? So that will be, spoiler, my question for you at the end. Tell me what you think of outlining and if your opinion has changed. Now, at this stage is when I actually start using craft books. I do really like Save the Cat Writes a Novel, especially for the sort of shard of glass and the whiff of death moments, and Romancing the Beat for the no ways and the sort of like push-pull dynamic over the course of romances. I was very kindly sent Save the Cat Writes a Young Adult Novel, which has a part that I've already read and tabbed for writing a series and series structure, so I'm gonna do a whole vlog on that later, but yes. Because basically now that I know how my characters like live and breathe and what drives them, and you know, what thing from childhood still makes them mad, what their favorite way to spend a day off is. You know, once I see my characters as more three-dimensional than I did before the zero draft, I know better what exact decisions they'll make so that I can stay true to that over the course of the entire like 80,000 plus word story I want to tell, right? So now I am fleshing out all of the outlining, and I like to do this concurrently with the timeline so that I can avoid a double Thanksgiving situation. If you know, you know. And the timeline I find is more important for mysteries because there's usually like a ticking clock aspect, but if you have a sort of like set deadline, like they have to save the world in 7 days or something, you know, that's when I find a timeline is extremely helpful. Or for contemporaries, especially if you're having to work around holidays, or if it's like, you know, you've been writing them at work the whole time and you're like, surely they would have had a weekend by now. This is so weird. Surely something should have happened on a Saturday. Or like if there's school to contend with, you know, just day-to-day life stuff, I find I need a timeline. And so what I'll actually do is I'll fill out my Scrivener doc following the beat structure of these two books, depending on the genre, and I will remove stuff that I don't find helpful for the actual story. So I'm sticking with the beats, but like not to the letter usually, but I do find it helpful to sort of fill it out to make sure that I have everything down. And for the timeline, I usually have it sort of color coded to match up with the most important beats. Now, the thing structure like this helps me the most with is the character motivation feeling smooth throughout the story. There's a lot of push-pull, as in real life. There's changing goals oftentimes as new information comes into your characters, but it needs to feel cohesive and like you as a reader can follow along with their logic, right? Like the logic needs to be sound even if it's very emotional logic. And it also helps me a lot with pacing. I am someone who, my stories probably move too fast. That's always my concern, they move too fast. I write shorter and have to put stuff in later because I'm moving the plot very quickly. So having this sort of structure oftentimes is really just to remind myself like, okay, yeah, we need to take a little breather, the characters need it, the reader needs it, and that will make the intense moments all that more intense by having this kind of moment of either like levity or like emotional downturn, you know, whatever. And really doing this outlining structure is just saving me a couple drafts. So I don't know time spent wise before I had this sort of structure if it's actually comparable. Like this part of the process might take me quite a bit of time to feel sort of solid in, to have done the zero draft and then to start doing the first draft off of all of this outlining. I did document the entire outlining process, I believe, for A Closet Full of Cauldrons, and it's not my favorite necessarily to have to write the story and segment it out necessarily in such a clinical way. It's not clinical, it's all creative, it's all wonderful, but like there gets to be a point for me for outlining, which is why I didn't do it for so long, where I'm just like, God, this sucks. This is the worst. But it helps me so much. Now I know, now I have learned. Yeah, and having it all written out like that is just, it is so helpful. I thought it for so long, but now I am convinced. I've been converted. And more than saving me a couple drafts, what it's really saving me is like when I'm stuck in later revisions where I'm like, I just don't know what's not working. Like, you know, you'll reread something and you're like, something feels wrong, but I couldn't pinpoint what. This makes it a lot easier for me to pinpoint what, because I have this much smaller condensed version of my story where I'm like, okay, well, it starts being really wonky around here and it picks back up here. So in this chunk, something's wrong. And I can usually be like, aha, it's this thing, which maybe that means I have to change this or I have to change this. But like I can much more easily pinpoint the problem, and that saves me so much agony. What I'm finding difficult now is I got on board with this with romances much more quickly. It took some time with fantasies. I love fantasy, I like writing fantasy. I find it inherently more difficult to write. Doesn't mean I don't enjoy it, I just find it harder, frankly, and that's okay. The problem I'm having now with, say, Project Death, I'm on draft 5, where I really zero drafted a whole bunch of it and then had to take out a character and then put the character back in a different way, and so you're going through a bunch of drafts, and I am now doing this process alongside this draft of Project Death, and I do wonder, I'm gonna be starting working on Meridian maps again, and in part using some whole series structure. That first book's already completely written, but what I'm gonna do is I'm going to revisit the timeline and work through with this new structure, kind of retrofitting, much like I am Project Death, this sort of structural element for my own brain to be able to see it better. And I think that what I'm going to notice is that it is much easier to write Meridian maps 2, 3, 4, and 5, starting with this outlining method, than having to do it sort of after the fact. Project Death is just a chunky boy. B-O-I, you know? And it's the chunkiest book I've ever written, and it needs to be because it's a standalone fantasy. But yeah, it is tough. I still really love it, but it is one of those where I'm like, how much different would this experience have been had I known what works for me now back then? But can't think like that really. Maybe Project Death is actually the story that has like propelled me into this. The heartache it has caused me. the headaches. Anyways, after I do all that, all that's really left is to draft the story, and then, you know, from there sort of get beta reader feedback. Drafts, I'd say maybe I need 1 or 2 drafts after doing this whole process. And then the reason it's hard to talk about a revision process, and why I won't right now, but maybe in the future I can come up with something, especially for something like romance that has like a more steady revision process, is that obviously each book is just so different. Different stories just encounter different problems that need to be addressed in revision, and so it's hard to give like exact advice on like how to revise something when it's like, well, is this a plot problem, or is it like a character motivation problem, or is it, you know, you kind of go down the list and you're like, well, is the world too big or too small? But that is it. That is my outlining process. Thank you to everyone who asked me about this. I'd love to know if you do end up trying a version of this, if it works for you, if your current outlining process is like this. Let me know if there's anything you have in addition to it. Let me know if there's anything you found recently, you've recently discovered, because this feels like a recent discovery, even though it ultimately has been years in the making. If you've recently discovered like the one thing that you can't not do before you start drafting, I would love to know. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all very soon with a new video. Bye!